Hey everyone, welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases. And it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. In the last episode, I shared my updated clinical model that maps your health journey in a macro sense, in a big picture sense, right? That's the topmost viewpoint that tracks your path forward from complex and chronic unwellness through 3 different stages. As a quick reminder, these stages are number 1, the restoration stage, that's restoring baseline function. This is followed by the optimization stage, which is about maintaining progress in building metabolic stability and resilience. And that is followed by the vitality stage, which is really all about fostering longevity and maintaining functional capacity into the future. Now, last time we talked about the restoration stage, right? The first stage, which is all about defining your root cause disruptors and doing the work that restores baseline function in the fundamental systems that underlie all human function, right? This is all about defining the imbalances or the deficits or the obstacles in your metabolic foundation, which spans everything from blood sugar to tissue oxygenation to energy metabolism, stress chemistry, circadian rhythms, immune competence and control, as well as thyroid and reproductive hormone balance. And we could throw a few more in there if we kept going. And I made the point last time that data is data, right? But what that data means to us depends on the perspective that we use to interpret that data. So given any individual person's medical history in a set of labs, a conventional medical provider will try to find a disease to manage, usually with drugs, while I can look at the same data and the same history, and I'm going to look for root cause disruptors, asking the question, where did you lose your health and how do we get it back? And that is essentially the core difference between a conventional physician and a functional medicine practitioner like I am. Now, in one sense, the first stage of restoration is designed to get you back to that baseline metabolic control that we've been talking about. And this is required for symptom resolution, and it's required for improved quality of life. But the question is, once you start to see your symptoms resolve and you're feeling pretty good, especially in comparison to where you started, should you stop there? Right? And to be honest, this is where I think a lot of practitioners fail, because if they don't take their clients through the next stage of the journey, there is a higher probability that things are going to start to slide back to where they started. The progress begins to unravel. Now, I'm sure that most of you by now have heard of the concept of plasticity, especially as it applies to the brain, right? Plasticity is how your brain learns to do things with efficiency. It's how we learn to ride a bike or play a sport or speak a language and so on. But here's the kicker. Plasticity can be good or bad, depending on if the outcome is desirable or not. I have spoken about this before in different episodes. For example, people with PTSD have plasticity in their stress and inflammation systems so that they just get really good at being stressed and inflamed. Like other tissues follow the same pattern. So you don't have to have formal PTSD to see this, but it can happen with head injuries or simply living in high stress environments, especially in your youth when your brain is developing and growing. But negative plasticity, where the outcome is something that's undesirable, is not constrained to the brain or stress chemistry or your immune system. And we see this in the medical literature, where they might talk about insulin resistance or Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, and they'll use terms like metabolic reprogramming or impaired plasticity, and these concepts are really identical. So this idea of metabolic reprogramming or negative plasticity resists change back to healthy baselines. And once change happens, metabolic reprogramming or negative plasticity always wants you to bring you back to your starting point, even if the starting point was not that great. Right? And this is why you start to feel better on a fairly consistent basis. Or I should say that this is why when you start to feel better on a fairly consistent basis, your work is not done, right? Not even close. So, and this is why the next stage of the health journey is optimization. which is defined by this notion of maintaining and building on the progress from the restoration stage. And it seeks to develop metabolic stability and resilience that resists return to the states of dysfunction that we started with, right? To overcome the metabolic reprogramming that's happened for months, weeks, months, or years, or however long it is that you've been struggling. And this is especially important in complex and chronic cases where metabolic reprogramming has had a chance to develop high states of efficiency in ongoing states of dysfunction, right? The longer that you have been in some state of dysfunction and the more systems that are involved that all interconnect and work together, the longer it takes to restore your metabolic baseline in stage one, and the longer you need to stay in the optimization stage. There's no hard guidelines like you spend 3 weeks in optimization or 3 months. There are no guidelines. And that's why I can't give you any hard and fast numbers. But in general, and this is me personally as a clinician, I like to see someone show me at least several months of roughly 75% improvement before we think about transitioning to the optimization stage. And once we hit that mark, we're usually okay to shift focus from active problem solving of that stage one restoration phase to maintaining stability and building resilience in the second stage of optimization. And as part of that, I like to define a couple of things. I like to define their sticking points and their flare patterns. So let me explain those. Sticking points are those physiological systems or specific lab findings that resist change, right? Sometimes they're connected to symptoms, especially the symptoms that are most long-lived, meaning the symptoms that they've been dealing with longer than others. Not always, but that's often the case. And on the diagnostic side, we often see great restoration of abnormal test results, but there are almost always a few that either haven't improved as much as the others, or sometimes they resolve, but then they keep coming back, right? It's normal and it's negative, it's negative and then it's positive, or it's normal and then it's positive. And it kind of flips back and forth between being in control and not. And in some cases, by the end of the restoration change, some lab values really haven't changed at all, even though symptoms have improved. And these then help us to develop an understanding of another concept, what I call points of vulnerability. And these are the chinks in their armor, so to speak. And when we combine that with the flare profile, so sticking points, points of vulnerability, and the flare profile, this becomes the focus of the second stage of the journey, where the goal is first to maintain progress, build stability and resilience, but also to identify these sticking points and to identify loose ends left over from stage one, because I can guarantee by the time you're feeling better symptomatically, everything's not better to the same degree, and we're not done in the process. And this is where the flare profile comes in. And one aspect of this is simply the balance between good days and bad days over the course of a week. And just to kind of flesh that out, some people will tell me, I have no good days. I feel bad all the time. And then the next step away from that would be, I do have some good days, but I have more bad days than good days. And then eventually someone says, well, the good and the bad days are roughly equal. And then the good days begin to outweigh the bad days. And eventually someone's feeling well, most, if not all of the time, with the exception of specific flare points. So that's one way to think about the flare profile, is just simply the balance of good and bad days during the week. And you can just look at your own circumstance and situation and come to some conclusion as to where you fall on that spectrum or in that scale. But we can also describe someone's flare profile in terms of the frequency, intensity, and duration of their flare-ups. In general, when someone flares less frequently, less intensely, and bounces back faster from the flare-up, this is the evidence of the metabolic and control and resilience that is so critical to have that we're watching for, right? So we need to see someone going from more bad days than good days to more good days than bad days. And we're looking for people to have less frequent, less intense, and more short-lived or shorter duration flare-ups. And when we start to see that pattern change, we know that we're restoring resilience and giving someone that metabolic stability that is so critical. Right. And in fact, it's the lack of metabolic stability and resilience that allows the metabolic reprogramming to take control and to bring you back where you are. Right. We can use your flare-up profile or your flare profile as an indicator of who's winning that tug of war. Are you winning it against your metabolic programming, or is the metabolic reprogramming that wants to keep you unwell, is that winning? Right. Now, the other aspect of the flare profile is what I would call the flare sequence, meaning that if we describe your problems, let's say as a set of dominoes that are all stacked up in a row, when a flare does happen, which domino falls first and which falls second and which falls third, and so on. And by dominoes, I'm referring to your flare-up symptoms. For example, I'm working with a woman right now who is she's pretty much ready to transition out of restoration into optimization. And she's about 70% better across the board. She's got fewer flare-ups that are shorter lived before she stabilizes and feels good again. When I asked her about her flare sequence, she said, well, most of the time it starts with a bad night's sleep, followed by brain fog, and then body inflammation. And that's a consistent pattern for her. So that's her flare sequence. I have another client pretty much at the same stage of her journey. And she said her flare sequence usually starts with her gut. And once her gut flares, then she gets tired mentally or, brain fog, mental fatigue, and followed by mood control issues. She gets anxious and she gets depressed. And so her flare sequence is different, and yours will probably be different too. And it will be unique to you. But all of these elements, sticking points of metabolic vulnerability, the flare profile, and sequencing. These are all cues and clues as to what we should be focusing on during the optimization stage. And I'll say it again, the longer you have been unwell, the more systems are involved, the more root cause disrupting mechanisms that you have in play, the longer it will take in stage 1 to restore baseline metabolic control, and the longer you're going to need to stay in the second stage of optimization, building resilience, right? But if you're paying attention during that first stage of restoration, you can define your metabolic vulnerabilities, you can understand your sticking points, and you can nail down your flare pattern and sequence, and you can use this to figure out what to do during optimization. Remember that the first goal of optimization is to not let your metabolic reprogramming win, to keep doing the things that help you long enough so that you reprogram, if that's a word, you reprogram your metabolic states to the point where you have defined a new normal, which is actually getting back to normal and healthy and staying there. Now, let me help you with timeframes so you can have some reasonable expectation. And please understand that, what I'm going to share right now are averages just based on my observations with the clients that I've worked with over the years. And meaning some people are going to need more or less than this. Others are going to be, some need less, some needs more. But in general, with the types of people who work with me in my one-on-one practice, the restoration stage usually takes 6 to 8 months to complete, give or take. And that might be quite a bit longer. Like, for example, if we're dealing with someone who has Lyme disease, if we're dealing with someone with mold issues, that's probably going to take 12 months, perhaps more. But absent those more complicated scenarios, restoration stage usually takes 6 or 8 months, again, give or take. The optimization stage, again, which is more about creating stability and resilience and maintaining your progress and understanding what your weak points are, your sticking points and your flare profile, that's going to, for most people, take another 6 months, perhaps a year. And again, it just depends on complexity. And I'll throw another thing in there. It also depends on compliance. Like, I can give you the most beautifully crafted functional medicine program, diet and lifestyle and supplementation in the world, but if you don't do it or don't do it 100%, you're not going to get the benefits from it, right? And I think everyone understands that. But if you are unwell and you've been that way for a while, you may have to spend a year or more restoring baseline function, cementing the progress to minimize and control your flare-ups before you can really think about things like longevity. And that, in a sense, is really what this little mini 3-part series is about. Yes, it's about how you break down the journey, the wellness journey, whatever trite cliche you want to use, into identifiable and reproducible stages, but it's all in preparation to get to the point where longevity is the conversation of the day, and all the things that you might be doing because you saw it on the internet or whatever, all the things you're doing for longevity, your longevity hack, so to speak, they really don't have a chance of helping you unless you've controlled your metabolic terrain and gone through this process of restoration of baseline function and then optimization where you're building resilience and stability. Longevity shouldn't even be, it should be in the picture, but it should be a couple of steps down the road, if that makes sense to you. So I know all this is just kind of like the rage right now, and for good reason. And I've done my fair share of speaking to that subject. But listen, you can't build longevity to any great extent if you haven't gone through that process of root cause resolution, restoration of normal baseline function, and spent enough time practicing what helps you so that you can spend your time not solving active metabolic problems, but building lifelong vital capacity and quality of life. So let me end this episode here. And next time we'll talk about the third and final stage of the journey, which is that vitality stage. I want to thank you guys for being part of the Inflammation Nation. And if you ever feel like you need some personalized help, you can use the link in the description to send a web request. We can talk about setting up a one-on-one Zoom consult so we can go through your history, talk about your goals, and think about what your journey would be like. I'll see you next time. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.